Picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 1895. Snow is falling softly on the rugged ancient mountains of western North Carolina. The air is crisp and smells of pine and wood smoke. And there, glowing against the deep blue twilight, is something that shouldn't exist. A palace, a French Renaissance château plucked from the Loire Valley and dropped into the American wilderness. This is Biltmore House. And tonight, for the very first time, its doors are opening. But calling Biltmore a house is like calling a great white shark a goldfish. It's a staggering understatement. We're talking about 250 rooms. Let that sink in for a moment. To put that in perspective, the White House has 132 rooms. Biltmore had nearly twice as many. This wasn't a home, it was a private kingdom under one roof. Its floor space covers 178,926 square feet. That's over 4 acres. 4 acres of heated, electrified indoor space at a time when most Americans were still using outhouses and lighting their homes with kerosene lamps. The construction took 6 years, an army of over 1,000 men, and cost $5 million. In today's money, that's the equivalent of nearly $190 million, and the numbers just keep coming. 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, a 70,000-gallon indoor swimming pool with underwater lighting, a 2-lane bowling alley, a library with 23,000 books, Italian stonemasons, French artisans, English woodworkers, Spanish tile setters, all brought to this remote mountain location to create a masterpiece of the Gilded Age. But here's what makes these numbers even more staggering. Biltmore wasn't built in New York City, where such extravagance might make a twisted kind of sense. It wasn't in the glamorous seaside enclave of Newport, Rhode Island, where the rest of its owner's family built their summer cottages. No, this palace, America's most expensive mansion, was built in the middle of nowhere, a quiet, undeveloped corner of Appalachia. But why? Why would anyone build something so impossibly large, so wildly out of place? What was the dark truth behind its creation, a truth of displacement and struggle that was carefully scrubbed from the official story? And perhaps most intriguingly, in an era where great family fortunes have vanished and their Gilded Age palaces have crumbled into dust, how has this one survived? To answer those questions, we need to understand the man who dreamed it all up, a man who was nothing like the family he came from. To understand Biltmore, you have to understand George Washington Vanderbilt II. And to understand George, you have to understand the Vanderbilts. His grandfather, Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, was the original American robber baron, a ruthless, hard-driving tycoon who built a colossal fortune in steamships and railroads. He was a man of immense power, but zero refinement. He famously boasted, "If I had learned education, I would not have had time to learn anything else." The Commodore died in 1877, leaving behind a fortune of nearly $100 million. That's roughly $300 billion in today's money. It was the largest personal fortune in America at the time, larger than the U.S. Treasury itself. He left almost all of it to just one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, George's father. And William Henry proved to be even better at making money than his father. By the time he died in 1885, he had doubled the family fortune. His sons and grandsons inherited that drive. They were titans of industry, expanding the family's empire, battling for control of the nation's arteries of commerce. They built massive mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York, monuments to their wealth and power, each one trying to outdo the last. They were loud, competitive, and obsessed with the family business. They married into European aristocracy through parties that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime and lived lives of almost incomprehensible excess. But George was different. While his older brothers Cornelius II and William were in the trenches of Wall Street, George did something the Commodore would have considered utterly wasteful. He became educated, truly educated. He was quiet, introspective, and fluent in multiple languages. He wasn't a businessman. He was a scholar, a collector, a man of deep and abiding culture. He was the youngest of 8 children, born in 1862, and by the time he came of age, the family fortune was so vast that he was free from the pressure of having to make more of it. His inheritance alone was worth tens of millions of dollars. So he dedicated his life to absorbing the best of human creation. He traveled the world, not for business, but for art, for books, for architecture. He would spend hours in dusty European libraries, his hands stained with ink, or wander through the ruins of ancient civilizations, sketching in his notebook. These weren't books bought by the yard to impress visitors. George had read them, annotated them in the margins in multiple languages. His personal collection would eventually swell to over 23,000 volumes, including rare first editions, illuminated manuscripts, and works in 8 different languages. He wasn't just a rich man who owned books, he was a bibliophile to his very soul. This fundamental difference is the key to everything. While his family was building an empire of capital, George was building an empire of the mind. In the 1880s, he began visiting Asheville, North Carolina, with his mother. The Gilded Age elite were just beginning to discover the area, drawn by the clean mountain air, which was believed to be a cure for tuberculosis and other ailments of the polluted industrial cities. Asheville was becoming a fashionable health resort, with grand hotels and sanitariums springing up to cater to wealthy visitors seeking respite from the smoke and grime of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. But for George, it was something more. He fell in love with the landscape. The rolling hills, the ancient mist-shrouded peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the way the light filtered through the trees at dawn, it spoke to him in a way that the marble halls of Fifth Avenue never could. He saw potential, but not the kind of potential his grandfather would have seen, not for a new railroad line or a coal mine. He saw the potential for beauty. He decided he would build his home here, his little mountain escape, he called it. But George Vanderbilt's idea of little was, to put it mildly, different from anyone else's. He didn't just want a house, he wanted to create a self-sustaining European-style estate, a place that wasn't just a drain on resources, but a productive working landscape. It would have its own farms, its own dairy, its own village for the people who worked there. And at its heart, it would have a home that was not just a showcase of wealth, but a living, breathing work of art. To bring this vision to life, he assembled a dream team. For the house itself, he hired the most famous architect in America, Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was the go-to architect for the Gilded Age elite, the man who had built the Vanderbilts' most ostentatious cottages in Newport. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, and he brought European sophistication to American wealth. For the grounds, he hired the only man who could match Hunt's genius, Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary designer of New York's Central Park. Olmsted was in his 60s by then, the grand old man of American landscape architecture. He had designed parks, college campuses, and entire planned communities, but he had never tackled anything quite like what George Vanderbilt was proposing. George took Hunt on a tour of France in 1889, visiting the great château of the Loire Valley, Chambord, with its distinctive French Renaissance architecture and 440 rooms, Chenonceau with its graceful arches spanning the River Cher, and Blois with its spiral staircase and mix of architectural styles. They also visited Waddesdon Manor in England, a Rothschild estate that proved you could build a French chateau on foreign soil. He wanted that same sense of romance, of history, of fairy tale grandeur. He wanted turrets and gargoyles, steeply pitched roofs, and sculptural ornamentation, but he wanted it built with the best of modern American technology. It would look medieval on the outside, but be absolutely cutting edge on the inside. This contrast was essential to his vision, the romance of the past married to the convenience of the future. In the land itself, Olmsted was horrified when he first saw it. George had purchased 125,000 acres, an area larger than many small countries, larger than the entire city of Atlanta. But it was not pristine wilderness. It was a patchwork of overexploited farmland, clear-cut forests, and struggling homesteads. Decades of unsustainable farming and logging had left the land scarred and depleted. Olmsted's assessment was blunt. The land was in terrible shape. He told George that this wasn't just a landscaping project. It was a massive work of environmental restoration. This is another key to George's character. Another man might have been deterred, but George embraced the challenge. He didn't just want a pretty garden. He wanted to pioneer scientific forestry in America, to prove that you could have a working forest that was both profitable and sustainable. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service to manage the forestry program. Later, Carl Schenck would establish the Biltmore Forest School, the first forestry school in America, right on the estate grounds. George was thinking on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. He wasn't just building a house, he was creating an entire ecosystem, a model for how humans could live in harmony with nature while still enjoying the fruits of civilization. It was an idealistic vision, perhaps even a naive one, but it was a vision that would change the landscape of America in ways he could never have imagined. So the vision was set. A French chateau, a restored forest, a working estate, all nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a dream of breathtaking ambition, a dream that would consume 6 years of his life, a vast portion of his fortune, and the labor of thousands of people. But first, George had to build it, and that would prove to be the challenge of a lifetime. Imagine you're a farmer in Buncombe County, North Carolina in 1889. Your life is governed by the seasons, by the hard-scrabble reality of mountain life. You grow corn and tobacco, raise a few hogs, and hope that the weather and the market will be kind to you. And then, one day, the world changes. A railroad spur 3 miles long is carved out of the wilderness, leading to a flattened mountaintop. And then the materials start arriving, an endless train of them: limestone from Indiana, steel from Pittsburgh, marble from Italy, slate from Virginia. An entire woodworking factory and a brick kiln, capable of producing 32,000 bricks a day, were built on site. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the region had ever seen. It was like a small city rising from the earth, dedicated to a single purpose: building George Vanderbilt's house. And the workforce, over 1,000 men. Local laborers, farmers looking for extra cash, were hired for the heavy lifting. They dug foundations, hauled materials, mixed mortar. For many of them, it was their first experience with industrial-scale construction. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and relentless. But for the skilled work, George and Hunt imported a legion of artisans from Europe. Italian stonemasons to carve the intricate details of the facade, their chisels bringing life to stone gargoyles and decorative flourishes. French craftsmen to work on the plaster moldings and ornate ironwork. Spanish architects, led by the brilliant Rafael Guastavino, to create the stunning self-supporting tile vaults that would become one of the house's most distinctive features. These men brought centuries of old-world craftsmanship to the New World wilderness. They lived in temporary housing on the estate, often separated from their families for months or years at a time, their entire lives dedicated to creating beauty for someone else's home. For 6 years, this remote corner of North Carolina was a hive of activity. The air filled with the clang of hammers, the shouts of foremen in multiple languages, the rumble of wagons and trains. It was a monumental undertaking, a logistical nightmare. Every single thing, from the nails to the massive slate tiles for the roof, had to be transported to this isolated spot. The railroad spur alone was a marvel of engineering. The house rose from the ground, a fantasy of turrets, gargoyles, and steeply pitched roofs. The east facade alone was 375 feet long, stretching across the landscape like a small town. The staircase tower, with its winding balustrade featuring statues of St. Louis and Joan of Arc, carved by the Austrian sculptor Karl Bitter, was a masterpiece of sculptural art in itself. Each of the 16 chimneys was unique, decorated with different motifs. The copper flashing on the roof was embossed with George's initials and family crest, originally gleaming with gold leaf that caught the mountain sun. And while the army of workers toiled in North Carolina, George was on a shopping spree across the globe. He wasn't just building a house, he was curating a collection. He bought 70-foot-long tapestries from the 16th century, woven in Flanders and depicting biblical scenes with threads of gold and silver. He acquired a ceiling painting from a Venetian palace, Napoleon's personal chess set, and gaming table, a collection of prints by Albrecht Dürer, Persian rugs that had once graced the floors of European palaces, and Chinese porcelain that was centuries old. He shipped back entire rooms, thousands of pieces of furniture, carpets, prints, and decorative objects, dating from the 15th to the late 19th century. Each piece was carefully selected, not just for its monetary value, but for its historical significance and aesthetic beauty. George was creating a living museum, a place where every object had a story to tell. This wasn't just about showing off wealth. It was about creating an authentic atmosphere. He wanted every room to tell a story, to be a complete work of art. The banquet hall, with its 7-story-high ceiling, Flemish tapestries, and triple fireplace large enough to roast an entire ox, was designed to evoke a medieval great hall. The library, a 2-story sanctuary of black walnut with a painted ceiling by the Italian artist Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini, was built to house his massive book collection, with a secret passage leading to the guest quarters. And beneath the opulence, the house was a technological marvel. It had full electricity from day one, a rarity in 1895. George was friends with Thomas Edison, and the house was wired for direct current. It had forced air heating, with vents cleverly hidden in the ornate decor. It had 2 Otis elevators, centrally controlled clocks synchronized throughout the house, a fire alarm system, and a servant call bell system with indicators in every room. It even had a walk-in refrigerator, dumbwaiters, and speaking tubes for communication between floors. But this grand creation came at a human cost. And this is where the official story begins to fray. The Biltmore website today speaks of a harmonious construction process, of workers who were well paid and treated fairly. But the reality was more complicated. We know there were labor disputes. Workers, many of them local and unaccustomed to industrial labor, pushed back against the demanding conditions. They argued for shorter workdays. The standard at the time was 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week. They demanded better pay for injuries sustained on the job, a constant danger in an era with few safety regulations and no workers' compensation laws. Construction sites were deadly places. Falls from scaffolding, crushed limbs from falling materials, burns from the kilns. These were the everyday risks that the men faced. In one documented incident, a group of Italian stonemasons went on strike, protesting what they saw as unequal treatment after a train car they were in broke down, leaving them stranded for hours in the cold. While the estate claims these disputes were resolved amicably, they offer a glimpse into the tension that simmered beneath the surface of this grand project. These were not happy peasants grateful for the work. They were men who knew their worth and were willing to fight for it. And then there was the land itself. The 125,000 acres George acquired weren't empty. This is the first dark truth they never told you. The land was home to dozens of families, small communities with their own histories, their own cemeteries, their own way of life. One of these communities was called Shiloh. Shiloh was a community founded by freed African Americans after the Civil War. It was a place of black ownership, of self-sufficiency, a testament to resilience in the post-slavery South. These were families who had worked the land for decades, who had built their homes with their own hands, who had buried their dead in small family cemeteries under the shade of oak trees. And it stood directly in the path of George Vanderbilt's vision. So, it was erased. The estate's official history says the land was in poor condition and that the landowners, including the residents of Shiloh, were glad to sell. Historical records show that Vanderbilt's agents often paid twice the assessed value for the properties. On paper, it looks generous. But was it truly a choice? Can a poor black farmer in 1880s North Carolina truly say no to the agent of one of the richest men in the world? The power dynamics were stark. These were people with limited options, living in a society that was still deeply segregated and hostile to black land ownership. The offer of cash, even generous cash, for land that was struggling to produce, it was an offer that was hard to refuse. But it was also an offer that came with the implicit understanding that refusal was not really an option. The community of Shiloh was relocated. The families were moved, their homes dismantled or abandoned. Their history was buried under the manicured lawns and picturesque forests of Vanderbilt's estate. Today, the Biltmore estate acknowledges that 5 pre-Vanderbilt cemeteries remain on the property, preserved and maintained. They are quiet, lonely reminders of the people who were here before, the people who had to make way for the dream. This is the uncomfortable foundation upon which the palace was built. A story of Gilded Age power dynamics where the vision of one man, backed by immense wealth, could literally move mountains and communities. It's a story of progress and beauty, yes, but also one of displacement and loss. A story that is rarely told to the millions of tourists who walk its halls, marveling at the tapestries and the marble. Finally, on Christmas Eve 1895, the work was done. George Vanderbilt, at 33 years old, welcomed his family and friends to his finished masterpiece. They arrived by private train, stepping into a world of unimaginable luxury. The house was ablaze with electric lights, a dazzling sight in the dark mountain night. For the next 2 decades, Biltmore would be his sanctuary, a place for intellectual pursuits, for lavish parties, for quiet contemplation. He married the beautiful and intelligent Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898 in a ceremony in Paris. She was a descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor of New York, and she brought her own grace and intelligence to the estate. Their only child, Cornelia, was born in the house in 1900 in the Louis XV room on the 2nd floor. It seemed like a fairy tale. A Gilded Age prince in his castle, surrounded by beauty, family, and a vast, productive estate. But the fairy tale was about to come to a brutal and sudden end. Imagine you're a guest at Biltmore in its heyday, around 1905. Your day is a whirlwind of curated leisure. A morning horseback ride through the manicured trails, past the perfectly tended gardens and through the restored forests. An afternoon of reading in the 2-story library, perhaps pulling a rare volume from the shelves with George's permission, settling into a leather armchair by the fire. A formal dinner in the banquet hall, with course after course served on fine china by an army of silent, efficient servants dressed in livery. Life at Biltmore was a performance, a carefully staged production of aristocratic country life. But behind the velvet ropes, a different reality existed. Running a 250-room house was a monumental task. It required a staff of around 80 people: butlers, footmen, housemaids, cooks, laundresses, gardeners, stable hands, chauffeurs. A permanent live-in workforce dedicated to maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury. There was a strict hierarchy among the servants. The butler and housekeeper were at the top, commanding respect and higher wages. Below them were the specialized servants, the chef, the lady's maid, the valet. And at the bottom were the scullery maids and kitchen boys, who did the hardest, dirtiest work for the lowest pay. Each person had their role, their uniform, their place in the machine. Their lives were a stark contrast to the guests they served. They lived in the less glamorous parts of the house, in the basement and the servants' wing. They worked long hours, following a rigid hierarchy and a strict set of rules. The house was designed with their labor in mind. Secret doors and hidden passageways allowed them to move through the house unseen, to appear as if from nowhere to light a fire or clear a plate, and then vanish again. They were essential, but invisible, the machinery that made the dream function. And then there was the cost, the sheer, crushing cost of it all. Maintaining Biltmore was ruinously expensive. The heating bills alone for the 4 acres of indoor space were astronomical. Coal had to be constantly fed into the massive boilers in the basement, the army of servants, the constant repairs, the upkeep of the massive gardens and grounds, the care of the horses and carriages. It was a constant drain on George's fortune. And this brings us to the second dark truth. Biltmore was not a sustainable venture. It was a financial black hole. George's vision of a profitable, self-sustaining estate was a noble one, but it was a dream, not a reality. The farm and the dairy brought in some income, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the outgoings. The estate was a magnificent, beautiful, all-consuming folly, a monument to one man's idealism and his willingness to spend a fortune to make it real. George was already feeling the strain. The estate was eating through his inheritance faster than he had anticipated. Then, in 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, establishing a federal income tax. For the first time, the vast incomes of men like George Vanderbilt were subject to taxation by the government. It was a fundamental shift in the American financial landscape, the beginning of the end for the Gilded Age's unchecked accumulation of wealth. For George, it was a disaster. The new financial pressure, on top of the already crippling maintenance costs, was too much. He was forced to start selling off his patrimony. He began negotiations with the federal government to sell a huge tract of his land, 87,000 acres of the forest that he and Olmsted had so carefully restored. It would become part of the Pisgah National Forest, a public resource for all Americans. It was a painful admission of defeat, a recognition that his dream was too big, too expensive to sustain. But before the deal could be finalized, tragedy struck. In March 1914, while in Washington, D.C. on business related to the land sale, George suffered an attack of appendicitis. He underwent what was supposed to be a routine emergency appendectomy, but complications set in. A blood clot formed, and on March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt the quiet scholar, the man who had dreamed a palace into existence, was dead. He was only 51 years old. He had only enjoyed his finished masterpiece for 19 years. His death was a shock, a devastating blow to his family and to the future of the estate. His wife, Edith, was left a widow with a 13-year-old daughter, Cornelia, and a magnificent, impossibly expensive white elephant. The dream had lost its dreamer. Edith, a capable and intelligent woman, did her best. She honored her husband's wishes and completed the sale of the 87,000 acres to the government, which would become the nucleus of the Pisgah National Forest. In doing so, she helped create one of the great public resources of the American South, a forest that millions would enjoy for generations. She scaled back the operations of the house, closing off large sections of it to save money. She moved into a smaller apartment carved out of the former bachelor's wing. She tried to keep the dream alive, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. She also sold Biltmore Estate Industries, the craft workshops that George had established, and Biltmore Village, the planned community that had been built to house estate workers. Piece by piece, the grand vision was being dismantled, but the world was changing. The Gilded Age was over, swept away by World War I and a new social and economic order. The era of private palaces was ending. The great Fifth Avenue mansions were being torn down and replaced with apartment buildings. The Newport cottages were being sold or abandoned, and Biltmore, the grandest of them all, was facing a slow, inevitable decline. The family's fortune, once thought to be limitless, was dwindling. In 1924, there was a glimmer of hope. Cornelia, now a beautiful young heiress, married a British aristocrat, the Honorable John Francis Amherst Cecil. The wedding was a grand affair, held in the village church on the estate grounds, with hundreds of guests and a reception in the house. It was a throwback to the estate's glory days, a moment of joy and celebration. It seemed possible that this new couple could revive Biltmore's fortunes, but the financial realities were inescapable. By the end of the 1920s, with the Great Depression looming, the situation was dire. The estate was on the verge of collapse. The maintenance costs were still astronomical, and there was no income to offset them. The family was hemorrhaging money. Banks were failing, investments were worthless, and the once mighty Vanderbilt fortune was evaporating. And so, in 1930, at the request of the city of Asheville, which was desperate to attract tourism and revive its own struggling economy, Cornelia and John Cecil made a fateful decision. They opened Biltmore House to the public. For the first time, ordinary Americans could walk through the halls that had been built for the elite, could see how the other half had lived during the Gilded Age. This was not a philanthropic gesture. It was an act of desperation, a last-ditch effort to generate enough income to keep the estate from being sold off and broken up. The family that had once prized its privacy above all else was now selling tickets to let the public wander through their home. The transformation from private kingdom to public attraction had begun. It was a humiliation, but it was also a necessity. But even that wasn't enough to solve the deeper problems, not just the financial problems, but the personal ones. The marriage between Cornelia and John Cecil was crumbling. They had 2 sons, but the relationship was cold and distant. And Cornelia, the girl who had been born in the grandest house in America, was about to make a decision that would become one of Biltmore's most shocking and enduring secrets. Imagine being Cornelia Vanderbilt. You grow up in a 250-room palace, a world of almost unimaginable privilege, but it's also a world of immense pressure. You are the sole heir to this vast, complicated legacy. The weight of your father's dream, of your family's name, rests on your shoulders. And it's a dream that is slowly dying, crumbling under the weight of its own grandeur. Her marriage to John Cecil, which had seemed so promising, produced 2 sons but little happiness. By the early 1930s, it was over. They divorced in 1934, and Cornelia did something that no one expected. She left. She didn't just move out, she abandoned Biltmore completely. She walked away from her home, her heritage, and even her 2 young sons, and never, ever came back. This is the third and perhaps the most personal dark truth of Biltmore. The heiress rejected her inheritance in the most dramatic way possible. She moved to Paris, then to London. She joined the bohemian art scene, a world away from the staid aristocracy she was born into. She reportedly dyed her hair pink and began calling herself Nilcha. She cut herself off from her past, from the great stone palace that represented everything she was running from. Why? We can only speculate. Was it the pressure? The ghosts of a past she couldn't live up to? The suffocating weight of expectations? A desire for a life of her own, free from the gilded cage of Biltmore? Or was it something darker, a deep unhappiness that she could never articulate? Whatever the reason, her departure sent a shockwave through the family. John Cecil remained at the estate, living in the bachelor's wing, raising his sons and managing the tourist business until his death in 1954. But the heart of the family had been ripped out, and the crises kept coming. The estate was a place of simmering tensions, a clash between the old world of the Vanderbilts and the new world of public access and economic hardship. And sometimes, those tensions exploded into violence. This brings us to the fourth dark truth, the story of Walter Brooks. It was 1922. The estate was no longer the private sanctuary it had once been. It was a sprawling property with porous borders, and the Biltmore Forest Development Company employed guards to patrol it. One of these guards was Walter Brooks, a man doing a difficult job in a time of social tension. The estate was a symbol of wealth and privilege in a region where many people were struggling. Resentment simmered. One day, he confronted a group of 5 young men in a car near one of the gates at the old Shiloh entrance. The very name was a reminder of what had been lost. Accounts of what happened next differ. Brooks claimed the men were trespassing and threatened to take the place. He said they advanced on him aggressively and he acted in self-defense. But it later emerged that one of the young men believed Brooks had recently killed his dog while it was chasing a deer on the property. There was bad blood, a simmering resentment, an argument erupted, and it ended in gunfire. Brooks shot and killed 2 of the young men and wounded a 3rd. 2 others escaped. It was a brutal, bloody incident, a far cry from the genteel image the estate projected. The subsequent trial was a local sensation, covered extensively in the newspapers. Brooks was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years of hard labor. The incident laid bare the conflict between the private, guarded world of the estate and the local community that surrounded it. It was a stark reminder that the idyllic landscape could also be a place of violence and death, and the house itself seemed to hold on to these dark memories. Staff and visitors began to report strange occurrences. Ghost stories started to circulate, whispers of a headless cat, of a lady in black who haunted the eerie, white-tiled indoor swimming pool. There were rumors of a child drowning in that pool, a story the estate has always denied, but which persists to this day. People heard splashing from the empty pool, the clinking of glasses from long-gone parties, and disembodied voices in the grand staircase. The most persistent ghost, they say, is George Vanderbilt himself. His spirit is said to linger in his beloved library, the heart of his home. Visitors have reported the feeling of a presence, the scent of his cigar smoke, and even fleeting glimpses of a shadowy figure sitting in his favorite chair, forever reading. His wife, Edith, is sometimes said to be seen as a spectral shadow, forever searching the house for the husband she lost too soon, calling his name in the empty halls. Staff members over the decades have reported doors opening and closing on their own, cold spots in certain rooms, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying that Biltmore holds onto its past in ways that are both tangible and intangible. And so, by the mid-20th century, Biltmore was a house of ghosts, haunted by the spirit of its creator, by the memory of violence, and by the absence of the heiress who had fled from it. It was a National Historic Landmark, a tourist attraction, but it was also a shadow of its former self. Financially, it was still on a knife's edge. The dream was fading. It seemed destined to become just another crumbling relic of a bygone era, a cautionary tale about the folly of excess. But the story wasn't over. One of the sons that Cornelia had left behind was about to return, and he would bring with him a radical new vision that would save Biltmore from ruin, and in doing so, create a new model for how America's historic treasures could survive in the modern world. He understood something that his grandfather had perhaps not fully grasped, that in America, nothing survives on sentiment alone. Everything must earn its keep, must prove its value in the marketplace. It was a hard lesson, but it was the lesson that would save Biltmore. In the late 1950s, William A.V. Cecil, George Vanderbilt's grandson, returned to the estate. He had grown up in the shadow of the great house, raised by his father after his mother Cornelia had left. He had seen the state of his inheritance, a magnificent decaying mansion that was bleeding money. The tourism business was barely keeping it afloat. The house needed constant repairs. The roof leaked. The infrastructure was aging, and the visitor numbers were stagnant. Most people in his position would have given up. They would have sold the house to the government or sold the remaining land to developers. It was the logical thing to do. But William Cecil was his grandfather's grandson. He saw the potential. He saw the value in what George Vanderbilt had created, and he was determined not to let it die. He had a vision, just as his grandfather had. But his vision was different. It was a vision of survival through adaptation. He and his brother, George Cecil, who had inherited the more profitable dairy farm which had been spun off as Biltmore Farms, came up with a plan, a revolutionary plan. They would stop treating Biltmore as a museum and start treating it as a business, a modern, forward-thinking hospitality and tourism business. This was the survival secret, the key to how Biltmore endured when so many other Gilded Age mansions fell. William Cecil realized that the house alone was not enough. People would come once to see it, marvel at the opulence, and then move on. But they wouldn't come back. He needed to give them more to do, more to see, more to experience. He began to innovate. He revitalized the gardens, bringing back Olmsted's original vision. He opened new areas of the house to the public, areas that had been closed off for decades. He invested in marketing, bringing in professional managers and consultants. And then he had his most brilliant idea. In the 1970s, he decided to revive his grandfather's vision of a self-sustaining estate. He looked at the land, at the old dairy buildings, and he decided to start a winery. It was a huge gamble. No one thought you could grow European-style wine grapes in North Carolina. The climate was too humid, the soil was wrong, it would never work. But Cecil persisted. He hired a French winemaster, Philippe Jourdain, and in 1985, the Biltmore Estate Winery opened. It was a massive success. The winery became a huge draw, bringing in a new stream of revenue and a new type of visitor. Wine enthusiasts came from all over the country to tour the winery, taste the wines, and explore the estate. It was the turning point. From there, the estate continued to expand and professionalize. They built hotels on the property, allowing guests to stay overnight and experience the estate over multiple days. They opened restaurants, shops, and an outdoor adventure center with hiking, biking, and river activities. They turned Biltmore from a one-day tourist stop into a multi-day resort destination. They created a brand, a lifestyle, an experience, and it worked. Today, Biltmore is a thriving, profitable enterprise, still privately owned by the descendants of George Vanderbilt. It attracts 1.4 million visitors a year, making it one of the most visited historic houses in America. The estate employs over 2,400 people, making it one of the largest private employers in Western North Carolina. It's a model of historic preservation, proving that you can save the past by making it pay for itself in the present. William Cecil didn't just save his family home. He created a new paradigm for how historic houses could survive in the modern economy. Other estates have followed his model, but none have achieved quite the same level of success. But the success came with its own controversies. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Labor found that Biltmore had violated labor laws related to the H-2B guest worker program. The estate was ordered to pay back wages to a worker who had been underpaid. It was a reminder that even in the 21st century, the tensions between management and labor, between wealth and work, still existed at Biltmore. and there are questions about the estate's tax situation. The house is assessed at $157.2 million, but the estate only pays property taxes on $79.1 million thanks to an agricultural deferment. Critics argue that this is a loophole that allows a highly profitable tourist business to avoid paying its fair share. The estate argues that it's following the law and that the agricultural operations are legitimate. So now we can answer the questions we asked at the beginning. Why was it built here? Because one man, a man different from his family, saw beauty and potential in the North Carolina mountains. He wanted to create not just a home, but a work of art and a model of a working estate. He wanted to prove that wealth could be used for something more than just accumulation, that it could create beauty and sustainability. He chose this location not because it was fashionable or convenient, but because it spoke to something deep within him. It was a place where he could escape the pressures of his family name and create something entirely his own, something that would outlast him and speak to future generations about what was possible when vision met resources. What is the dark truth behind it? The truth is that this beautiful dream was built on a foundation of Gilded Age inequality. It was built with the labor of 1,000 men who fought for their rights and on land that was once home to communities who were displaced to make way for it. Its history is marked by tragedy, by sudden death, by family conflict, violence, and abandonment. It's a story of immense privilege and its consequences. And how did it survive? It survived because George Vanderbilt's descendants inherited his vision and his tenacity. They refused to let the dream die. They adapted, they innovated, and they transformed a private palace into a public treasure and a profitable business. They found a way to make the past relevant to the future. They turned a liability into an asset. In doing so, they created a blueprint that other historic estates have tried to follow. The key was understanding that preservation doesn't mean freezing something in time. It means allowing it to evolve, to serve new purposes, to find new audiences. Biltmore survived because it was willing to change, even as it honored its past. Biltmore Estate is more than just America's most expensive mansion. It's a story about ambition, art, and the staggering power of Gilded Age wealth. But it's also a story about the hidden costs of that ambition. It's a story of survival, of a family's struggle to preserve a complicated and beautiful legacy. It is a house that holds the dreams of its creator and the ghosts of its past in every stone. And it stands today, not just as a monument to a bygone era, but as a testament to the enduring power of a family that refused to let go. It's a reminder that history is never simple, that beauty and injustice can coexist, and that the stories we tell about the past are always incomplete. There are always secrets, always truths that are hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. The next time you visit Biltmore, as you walk through those grand halls and marvel at the tapestries and the marble, remember the people who built it. Remember the communities that were displaced, their names and stories largely forgotten. Remember the workers who fought for their rights, who risked injury and death to create this monument. Remember George, the dreamer who died too soon, leaving his masterpiece unfinished in so many ways. Remember Cornelia, who fled from it all, seeking a life beyond the shadow of the great house. And remember William Cecil, who saved it by transforming it, proving that even the grandest dreams can adapt and survive. Because Biltmore is all of those stories. It's a palace and a folly, a dream and a burden, a triumph and a tragedy. It's America's most expensive mansion, and it's a mirror reflecting the best and worst of who we are, who we were, and who we might become.